On behalf of the History Department and the Dickey Center, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's lecture, Routine Turmoil or Historic Transformation, Understanding the Changes Underway Around the Arab World. And it's also my honor to introduce Rami Khouri to you. He's the director of the Assam Ferris Institute of Public Policy and International Affairs at the American University of Beirut, as well as editor-in-large of the Beirut-based daily Star newspaper, which is published by the International Herald Tribune. In addition to which, he's an internationally recognized political columnist, author, and commentator. Rami was born in the United States. His parents were journalists sent to cover the UN debates in 1947 about the future of Palestine. And so he must have inherited a family gene of journalism. He returned to the United States and received degrees from Syracuse University. So snow is also a known quantity to him. And then he went on to a most distinguished journalism career and has traveled widely across the Middle East. He's been awarded a number of distinctions and appointments here and abroad, a Neiman Journalism Fellow at Harvard, a fellow at the JFK School at Harvard too, with the Brookings Institution, with the Maxwell School at Syracuse, Georgetown, and others in Jerusalem and Jordan. There are few more experienced or better informed individuals than Rami Khouri, and we have been extraordinarily fortunate to bring him here this afternoon, and as the Middle East is facing profound changes. Join me in welcoming our distinguished guest at this most opportune moment. Rami.
Thank you, Gene. Thank you all for coming out and for having me here. I've been wanting to come to Dartmouth for many, many years. I have two very close friends from my primary school days and my high school days back in the last millennium who both went to Dartmouth, and I've spoken very highly of it. So I'm really happy to be here and share with you thoughts about what I believe is actually happening in the Middle East and the Arab world. There's an incredible moment that we're passing through, and I think this, for many of you who are students of the Middle East or interested in the Middle East, I think you will look back on this in the same way that my generation looked back on the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and events of that magnitude. I'll speak for about half an hour. That's an American half hour, not an Arab half hour, so it'll actually be a half hour. And that way we'll have a lot more time for Q&A. That way we can also, I'd like to hear your comments and thoughts and questions and respond to the issues that you find particularly important. There's just such an enormous amount of activity going on in the Middle East that it's really hard to know where to start. So I think the most useful thing that I can do is give you a quick overview of what I think are, what is going on, why it's happening, what are the implications, and what you as, say, Americans, I assume most of you are Americans, but those of you who are not, what your countries, foreign countries, can do or should do in a situation like this. The first thing I would say is that what is going on is not unanticipated. It may be something dramatic for people in the United States or in Europe or in other places. Those of us living in the Middle East, writing about it, analyzing it, studying it, experiencing it, many of us for years, for decades, since the 1980s probably, have been talking about the underlying tensions and the stresses in the region. And if you look back over the last 20, 30 years, you find many, many cases, examples of local movements, local activities, local initiatives where people across the region, especially in Egypt, where people have challenged their governments, have challenged foreign occupation, whether it's Israeli occupation of Arab lands, whether it's Syrian influence in Lebanon, whether it's Iranian influence in different Arab countries, whether it's American armies, British armies in the region, whoever it is, if there's an army or a political force from another country in Arab countries, people have pushed back against it. And there's been many examples of people throughout the region challenging the conditions that they are uncomfortable with, whether it's political subjugation, foreign occupation, corruption, abuse of power, police states, economic exploitation, lack of opportunity, and just the basic degradation that comes with feeling that you are treated neither as a full human being nor as a citizen with rights in your own country. And we've had this going on for years and years in the region. And if you look back, you can see in Egypt, for instance, you had the Kifaya movement, you had the Muslim Brotherhood for years and years, you had the student movements, you had the labor unions, you had the judges and lawyers challenging, you had civil rights, human rights and civil rights movements. There's a whole range of people in Egypt who've pushed and pushed and pushed and gotten whacked by their own government, supported by foreign governments, especially the United States. So it's really incorrect and unfair for people to say, and if you hear any of these sort of half-informed people on cable television tell you, oh, we didn't see this coming, you should tell them, well, you should have seen it coming because it was very obvious to anybody who took a minute to look and see what was going on in these societies, that people in these societies have been complaining and trying to be active for years, expressing their discontent with their conditions and trying to do something about it, but constantly being beaten down by the power of the modern Arab security state, supported by foreign governments, with massive support, especially from the United States and European countries, and before that from the Soviet Union. So there's nothing surprising about this. We know that there's massive discontent across the region, in most of the region. And the reality in the Arab world is we have two Arab worlds. There's 350 million Arabs, about maybe 20 million of them or so, 25 million, something in that range, live in the wealthy oil-producing countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Qatar, etc. And these are countries with no major socioeconomic stresses. They have some lower income people, some unemployed people, but by and large, these are welfare states with a lot of money, small indigenous populations, and the government takes care of people. And there are some complaints about political discontent in places like Bahrain, maybe Kuwait. You have individuals who complain that they're not given their full rights, etc. But there isn't massive, widespread economic stress or social discontent in the oil-rich states. So you take away about 15% of the Arab population. It leaves you with something like 320 million Arabs who are not well off. They are middle and low income people. They have been low income and relatively poor for the most part, and have actually gotten more poor over the last 20 or 30 years. If you take World Bank statistics, for instance, World Bank data shows you that the per capita gross domestic product adjusted for 2000 prices, per capita gross domestic product, the average income per person across the whole Arab world for the whole region, including the oil-rich states and others, was around $2,600 in the 1980s. It's now down to something like $2,300. And this is an extraordinary figure. And this is an average for each of these decades. But in other words, the Arab world is poor by and large and has been getting more poor. So you take the Arab world and take away the rich people and look at the rest of it, which is largely poor or low income or poor. Second of all, there is significant discontent that has been clearly expressed over the years by all kinds of groups who have tried to express themselves, but like I said, have been beaten back by the modern Arab security state. But we now have really fascinating, important political evidence of political discontent and social and economic discontent. And I want to give you just a couple of figures that come from the polling data that has been carried out across the entire Arab world, 22 Arab countries, by the Gallup organization, an American organization, who has carried out these polls twice a year across the entire region, interviewing tens of thousands of people, and so that you have really, truly representative samples in every country. And they've taken the young people, aged 15 to 29, and they've taken adults 30 and over. And the data that has come out of this polling in the last three surveys, the last three polls that were done over every 6 months they do this. So the last three that were done in 2010 and 2009 revealed some really, really startling facts. Let me give you a couple of statistics only. If you want more of this information, and those of you who study the Middle East, I urge you to do so, go to a site called Silatech, S-I-L-A-T-E-C-H, S-I-L-A-T-E-C-H, Silatech.com, I think it's .com. Silatech is a Qatari group in the state of Qatar, which was set up to try to study how young Arabs can make the transition from education to jobs. And they hired Gallup to carry out these surveys for them. And there's massive amounts of information on the Silatech site. But what the surveys of young Arabs show are, for instance, that across the whole region, about 30%, 1 out of every 3 Arab young people, want to leave, immigrate permanently and go. And mostly for economic reasons. They can't get a job, or if they have a job, they can't make ends meet. They don't have enough money to get married. Or in some cases, like Tunisia, because of political discontent. They don't want to live in a system that doesn't give them their full rights. That's 30% for average for the whole region. When you take lower income countries, Yemen, Morocco, countries like that, Egypt, the figure rises to 40%. 4 out of every 6 young Arabs, if you take this whole room, 40% of you, this whole section of this whole room, wants to leave and get out of the country for good. And these are the young people who are educated, who are the most productive, the most creative, have the greatest potential, and they want to get the hell out of these countries and leave for good. In some countries, it reaches 43, 40, in Tunis, it's 46%. People say, well, how did things happen in Tunis? Well, if anybody who had looked at Tunis and taken the time to see would have seen 46% of the youth wanted to immigrate permanently in Tunisia. In Morocco, it's 43%. Another figure is in the middle and low income countries of the Arab world, about an average of something like 52, 53% of young people only have confidence in the government. The rest of the people have no confidence in their government. In the high income countries, the Qatars, the Kuwaits, it's 90%. So they have no problem there. They trust their government, the government takes care of them. But in the vast majority of Arab countries, there's very, very serious lack of confidence in the government. Same in the judicial system. Around 50% of young people have faith in the judicial system. The rest of them don't. Only about 35% of young Arabs in the vast majority of countries feel that elections are fair and free and credible. 2/3 of young people in the Arab world feel their elections are a fraud. They're a hoax. They're not serious. So you have all of these indicators. Another one which is really important, across the whole region, 32% only, 32%, less than 1 in 3 of young people of your age, less than 1/3 feel they can have affordable housing. They can rent or buy a house. They can't, 2/3 of the people in the Arab world can't afford to get married and get a house. I mean, these are just specific little bits of statistics, but behind these is a much bigger problem of serious discontent anchored in socioeconomic disparity and stress, combined with political autocratic governments which don't give the average Arab an opportunity to really express himself or herself, and creating a combination of tensions and frustrations that caused this Bouazizi fellow in Tunisia to finally go burn himself, kill himself. He graduated from school, he couldn't get a job. He went and got a cart to sell vegetables to get enough money to feed his brothers and sisters, his younger brothers and sisters, and a police lady came and whacked him on the head. And this combination of economic desperation and political heavy-handedness and security heavy-handedness by the police state created a combination that we know has been combustible for decades. And finally, in rural Tunisia, it came to the surface. And there's many other statistics that people can study, but I mentioned these only to give you an idea of why there is so much pressure building up in these societies. The other important thing to keep in mind, the data about young people is almost identical, except for the will to immigrate. In every other department, the data among youth is identical to the data among adults. In other words, this isn't just young kids with extra hormones who are, anxious don't know what the hell to do with themselves. This is young people are an accurate reflection of the discontent and the pressures and the stresses on all of Arab society in these medium and low income countries, which are 85% of the entire Arab world. There's 310 million people out there in the Arab world who have these problems. Political frustration, economic stress, they want to immigrate and nobody will take them. And on top of it, you have the pressures of the frustrations from the Arab-Israeli conflict, the continued Israeli colonization and expansion of Israeli settlements in Arab lands, the lack of ability of the Arab world to do anything about Israel keeps attacking Palestinians, or in Lebanon or Gaza, strangulating Palestine, the tensions that come out of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the extra tensions that come out of foreign armies, most recently the American, the British, and others coming into Iraq or other Arab countries. So all of these things build up together to create a momentum of dissatisfaction, which in the lives of ordinary people across this region at some point converge to send individuals or entire societies to send them over the edge. Something snaps. When you can't feed yourself, you can't get a job, you can't go out and sell vegetables, you can't complain, you can't vote in a free election, you don't have trust in the courts, you don't feel that the system is giving you a chance, and you see what's going on in Palestine and Israel and Lebanon and Gaza and Iraq and all of these things together, and Condoleezza Rice comes and says, oh, this is the birth of a new Middle East. And Hillary Clinton comes and says, oh, well, we find this is an important moment for human rights, and something snaps. And you can't predict when it's going to happen. It snapped among African Americans in the 1950s when they refused, when Rosa Parks said, I'm not going to the back of the bus. Why did Rosa Parks say that in 1953? Why did people go out in the streets of Birmingham in 1964 and face the police dogs? I don't know. Why didn't they do it 5 years before or 5 years later? Something happens cumulatively when you're subjected to continual degradation to the point of dehumanization by your own society as well as by foreign powers in our case. Something happens to make you snap. And what's happening in the Arab world today is that hundreds of thousands of people, I believe, supported emotionally by probably 200 or 300 million other Arabs, are standing up and saying, we will not sit in the back of the bus. We will not be degraded and dehumanized. We will affirm our humanity, we will affirm our citizenship rights, and we will affirm our God-given birthright to dignity, to freedom, to equality, to opportunity, and to use all of our human senses, to read what we want, to speak, to debate, to go to theater, to walk in the streets, to listen to music. People are just simply saying, we want to live as normal human beings. It's fascinating to watch the discussions going on around the events in Tunisia and Egypt for how little ideology they have, how little policy questions. They're not talking about taxation rates or education decisions or even foreign policy. They're not talking about Israel or America or Russia or China. They're not talking about specific policy issues. It's people just standing up and saying, I'm fed up of being treated like an animal. I want to be treated like a human being. This extraordinary manifestation of their own self-affirmation of their humanity and their citizenship is the single most important thing that is happening in the Arab world, I believe, since the establishment of the modern Arab state system in the 1920s. There's other important milestones. The 1947-48 war and the creation of Israel and the disenfranchisement and dispersal and refugiehood of the Palestinians was a critical moment in our history. In the 1970s and 80s, the Arab states becoming more or less security and police states, anchored in money that came from oil and foreign support. The American invasion of Iraq. These were all important milestones in the way, but this is the most important thing that has happened in the Arab world since the modern Arab world was created by the retreating European powers in the 1920s and the 1930s. We don't know where it's going to go. We don't know what the full consequences are, but it's unbelievably important to simply acknowledge that hundreds of millions of people, represented by a vanguard of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands in Tunisia and in Egypt, but you will see this rippling across the region, are basically saying that they want to transform their political systems. They don't want to continue living in these same systems. What are the causes of that? I described quickly this sense of dehumanization. I think if you analyze it more deeply, you will find other reasons. Over the last 80, 90 years, there's been a massive population growth in the Arab world. Economic growth has not kept up with population growth. The Arab world had 60 million people in 1930. It now has 350 million people. At the birth of the modern Arab state system in the 20s, the region was around 20% urban, 80% rural. Today, the Arab world is around 65% urban, 35% rural. The region at its birth was largely made of middle-aged or older-aged people. Today, 65% of the Arab world is under the age of 30. This was a region that was largely uneducated and agrarian. Today, it is mostly urban and educated. The vast majority of people in the Arab world, thanks to a relatively effective state-building process from the 1930s to the 1980s, the vast majority of people can walk to a health center on their feet. They don't even need a car. They can walk to a health center. They can walk to a school. They have clean water within their home or within the neighborhood. In other words, you have a young, urban, well-serviced, relatively well-serviced population in terms of its basic needs, with significant economic stress and lack of opportunity, and almost total lack of political opportunity and political rights. That's a combustible combination. You've had in the Arab world, it's the only region, entire region of the world that is collectively and chronically non-democratic. With the transformations of the democratic wave after the fall of the Soviet Union and other periods, only the Arab world remained excluded from the democratization wave that struck the whole world. And why? And it's not the Islamic world, it's the Arab world. Because you had Muslim countries like Turkey, like Malaysia, other places that were quite democratic and economically vibrant. But the Arab world remained non-democratic, with massive support for this status quo, again, from the West and other places. We've had a situation in the Arab world where the central governments in most of the countries, other than the oil producers I mentioned, where the central governments have been increasingly unable to meet their basic needs of the people. I said that there was tremendous state building from the 30s to the 80s. But after the mid-1980s, we started to have the transition to the stress that we feel today. We didn't have these pressures in the 1950s and 60s. There was anger against Israel, anger against the British or the Americans or the French for political issues. We had the Arab-Israeli wars. We had the Cold War, the US and the Soviets manifested through local proxies. But you didn't have this kind of pressure. You didn't have people who went around burning themselves to death or challenging their governments in the central squares of their cities in front of the tanks. But you have it today, because in the late 80s, population growth surpassed economic growth, and therefore the ability of the central governments to keep providing everybody's needs declined slowly. And what this resulted in was a shrinking of the impact and the footprint of many of the central governments. And therefore you have situations throughout the region where other groups stepped forward, Islamic groups, Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, private sector people, non-governmental organizations, foreign aid donors, UN agencies, charitable societies, all kinds of people stepped forward to provide those services that the central governments were not able to provide to all their people. They were able to provide them to large chunks of their people, but not to all of them. And therefore, we've had the emergence in the region of multiple authorities within individual countries. So if you take Lebanon, you find Hezbollah is a very powerful, legitimate group which emerged partly to provide the Shiites, who had been very downtrodden, with an empowerment movement to give them their rights, but mostly to fight the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon, which they did successfully and drove the Israelis out in 2000. You had the emergence of Hamas in Palestine. You had all kinds of tribal groups, Islamist groups, non-governmental organizations emerging to play a role in society, and therefore the central authority and command of the state dissipated on the edges, and you ended up with societies with all kinds of different actors. And the other thing that has been going on for the last 20 years or so is that the Middle East has been a society that was transformed from a region in which there had been traditionally two major sources of conflict, the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Cold War, the Russian-American Cold War and its proxy battles. Today, the Middle East is a very different place. There's all kinds of conflicts in the region. Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan, the tensions with Iran, Algeria for many years. There's all kinds of conflicts, let alone the emergence of this new criminal class of Al-Qaeda and the terrorists like Al-Qaeda. And you have now multiple conflicts all over the region. And you have all of the major principal actors, the Arabs, the Iranians, the Americans, the Israelis, and the Turks, all of them using violence and justifying it. And you can each decide for yourself if the violence that all of these people use is justifiable or not. That's besides the point. But you have governments, and you have opposition movements and terrorist movements and foreign armies, all routinely engaging in the language, in the vocabulary of armed violence and conflict. And so this region is just overwhelmed with violence as a daily routine. The Arab-Israeli conflict has been and remains the most radicalizing and destabilizing source of tension in the Middle East for the last 50, 60 years. There's other problems. It's not the cause of all the problems of the region, but it is the single most enduring and most profound source of radicalization and extremism in the region. Resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict in an equitable manner that responds to the rights of the Israelis and the Palestinians and the other Arabs to all live in peace with equal rights simultaneously applied, not giving Israel its security and then see what we get as the crumbs. simultaneously giving Israeli and Palestinian and Arab security, sovereignty, statehood, and dignity. That is the key to reducing the role of the Arab-Israeli conflict as the great driver of extremism and violence and tension in this region. The inability to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict falls on many shoulders. I personally believe the Israelis are more to blame than the Arabs. The Arabs have come forth with a clear peace plan in 2002, prepared to live with Israel and have normal relations with it. Many people will have different views. The external role of the US and the Europeans and the Russians and the UN has been erratic at best and woefully inadequate in most cases. The Arab countries themselves can be probably more effective in clarifying what they mean by offering to live in peace with Israel. But Israel is in the driver's seat. Israel is the one that's building settlements and colonies and expanding its territory. Israel is laying siege to Gaza. Israel is the country that is, in our view, in the Arab world, the most to blame for the lack of a settlement. But we can argue this for days, and I've been arguing it for 40 years, and I'm happy to do it for another 40, but that's not going to get us anywhere. The question is, how do we move to a resolution that gives the Israelis and the Palestinians equal and simultaneous rights? That is the absolute key. Why did the Israeli peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt survive? Why were they achieved so quickly? Because they gave the Israelis and the Arabs equal and simultaneous rights. Why have we not had a breakthrough with the Palestinians and the Israelis? Because the whole peace process has been predicated on the principle that first we guarantee the security of Israel and it's maintaining its major settlement blocks, and after that we will then see what the Palestinians will get. That approach has failed. It should be dropped. There has to be a more rigorous, more humane, and more law-based approach that says the Israelis have rights to security and statehood and peace. The Palestinians have exactly the same rights and to end their refugeehood, and we've got to solve that problem by addressing those rights simultaneously. But the continuation of the Arab-Israeli conflict is a major driver of tensions around the region and has led to for instance, the birth of Hamas and Hezbollah in the 1980s was heavily related to the Israeli occupation of Arab lands. The Iranian tensions with Israel now are a relatively new phenomenon. If the Arabs and the Israelis had solved their conflict in 1972 or 75, there probably would be no Hamas and probably no Hezbollah. And you would not have the Israeli, Iranian Western tensions as we have them now. So it's so critical to understand the centrality of the Arab-Israeli conflict and resolving it peacefully. Just 2-3 more minutes and then we'll open up for questions and answers. What we're seeing in the region today, in the Arab world, is a continuation, I believe, of the single most important phenomenon in the entire Middle East, not just the Arab world, in the last 2 generations. And that is the phenomenon of individual people, movements, groups, and in some cases entire governments standing up and saying that they refuse to keep playing by the old rules. The old rules being that an European-dominated regional order in which Israel had the primary say in security arrangements and conservative Arab governments complied with American-Israeli demands and kept the region in a state of non-democratic marginalization. That period came to an end in the 1980s, partly with the rise of Hamas and Hezbollah, partly with the continued position of the Syrian government, partly with the Iranian Revolution, and now, I believe, manifested in a much more positive force, the affirmation by ordinary Arabs of their demands for freedom and dignity and democracy. And the end of docility is what I call this extraordinary phenomenon, the end of docility, the refusal of something like 500 million Arabs, Turks, and Iranians, 500 million Arabs, Turks, and Iranians, saying that they will not play by the old rules, that they will defy the powers that confront them, whether they're Arab governments, Israeli occupation forces, American, British armies, whoever it may be. It was the Afghans, the Russians in Afghanistan in the late 70s. That's where it started. It wasn't in the Arab world, and it wasn't with the Americans and Israelis. It was with the Afghans fighting the Russians. So this is not about Arabs and Israelis. This is not about Muslims and Americans. This is about human beings who refuse to continue to acquiesce in their own subjugation, occupation, marginalization, and dehumanization. Whether they're fighting for their liberty against Russians in Afghanistan, fighting for their liberty against Israelis in South Lebanon, fighting against Americans in Iraq or Afghanistan, or fighting against their own governments in Tunisia and Egypt and other places. This is a human response to the inhumanity that people have felt. This end of docility, this mass resistance to the status quo, I believe, is the single most important phenomenon that has defined the contemporary Middle East in my generation of the last 25, 30 years. We're now seeing it spill over into this extraordinary manifestation of citizens demanding their rights, citizens. Last point, what does this mean for the US, for Israel, for Europe, for non-Arab powers? I think this is a moment that is an opportunity for everybody to think fresh and start anew. If there are tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Arab people who want to live in democratic, peaceful societies, it is, I believe, morally correct and politically useful, politically expedient for foreign countries to be on the side of Arabs fighting for democracy and freedom, and not to sit there on the wall as some American officials and others are doing now and say, well, we're not sure, this might not be peaceful. And you know, the United States is the last country in the world to come to the Arab world and say, oh, we're worried about a little bit of violence after what the United States did in Iraq, unleashing the most destructive, wasteful, costly war in the modern history of the Middle East, creating 4 or 5 million Iraqi refugees, hundreds of thousands killed, trillions of dollars lost, and unleashing the genie of Shiite-Sunni tensions and ethnic cleansing across the region. The United States, Europe is the last country, last group of people in the world who should come to us and tell us, we're worried about a little bit of political violence in the streets of Cairo. This is hypocritical, it's not credible, and it's infantile. And I think what the United States and Europe and Israel and everybody outside the region should do is look at the people of the Arab world and see in them see in their eyes the desire to live in freedom, to live democratically, and to live peacefully with each other, and I believe with Israel and with the Western powers. It's very important for the world to finally come clean and say, are the people of the Arab world entitled to the same rights as the people of Kosovo, of Brazil, of Japan, of Israel, of Canada, of every other part of the world? Do the Arab people have these same rights, or do they have only secondary rights? I think this is the moment when the Arab people have started to speak for themselves. It's very important for the rest of the world to come clean and show that the world is with us in this battle for not just Arab rights, but universal human rights. It is the founding credo of your country that human beings were endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. All human beings, not just Americans, all human beings. Thank you very much.
Rami, thank you very, very much. A couple of ground rules. The floor is open to questions, but first from students, and secondly from faculty, and then if there's time for the more general audience. So students, this is your opportunity. Charlie.
Hi.
You have to wait for the mic, I think, right?
Yes. You have a student.
This is the Arabs telling the Americans.
First, thank you very much for coming. You mentioned that the Arab-Israeli conflicts are critical to the instability in the Arab world. What are the chances that Brotherhood succeeds, and if so, that further intensify the divide between the Arab world and Israel?
This is an issue. Can you hear me? It's okay, the mic's working. This is an issue that is on a lot of people's minds, and it's certainly a legitimate issue, and I think it needs to be discussed. My sense, knowing Egypt, knowing Muslim brothers, I've been talking to Hamas and Hezbollah guys most of my adult life, and as a journalist reporting on them and trying to understand them. My sense is that the Muslim Brotherhood, if it plays by the rules, which it has made clear that it does in Egypt, even the rigged rules of the Egyptian regime, it plays by the rules, they must be given an opportunity to play the political game by the rules set by the society. And I believe that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has been made into a boogeyman, where in reality, the truth about these Islamist groups is they've become big and strong with a lot of popular support, mainly because they were the only groups in these Arab countries that had the courage to challenge their regimes or challenge Israeli occupation or foreign armies or whatever. They were the only people who dared to stand up and challenge the system when everybody else was traumatized and beaten down by the security state in the Arab world, or by Israeli militarism, or by American jets. So they've become much bigger than they really are. If the Muslim Brothers were to operate in Egypt, I believe, in an open political system that truly was open and gave everybody an opportunity to play the political game and to run for parliament, I think they would probably get 15-20% of the vote, something in that range. So I think it's important to understand the Muslim Brotherhood for what it really represents. It's a social movement which has become politicized because you can't forbid religion. You can't close the mosques. Why was the civil rights movement in the United States anchored in the churches? Because the racist system in the South made it impossible for people to get their rights through the normal political system. They couldn't vote, they couldn't run for office, they couldn't use the courts. The only thing that was open to the civil rights movement was the churches. And hallelujah, brother, the churches provided a mechanism to mobilize, to organize, and to challenge an unjust system. You have a similar analogy. I'm not saying the Muslim Brothers are like Martin Luther King, but I am saying that in a system that forbids free political organization, it is absolutely normal for people to gravitate to their God, to their religion, when that is the only opportunity for them to meet and to talk and to organize. And I think we need to give these groups an opportunity to operate according to the democratic rules. So I'm not worried particularly. They should be in the coalition government. They've said that they will honor agreements that Egypt has made. And like I said, I'm quite sure that the vast majority of Egyptians don't want to go back to war with Israel. They'll keep the peace treaty. They'll probably change their political rhetoric. I don't think the new Egyptian government that's more democratic will, for instance, play the role that this Egyptian government does, which is to help the Israelis lay siege to Gaza. I think the Egyptian government will say this is immoral, this is inhuman, that if Israel and Hamas have a political conflict, you don't starve people. You don't. The young kids in Gaza in the last 5 years, according to United Nations statistics, have been stunted. And to be stunted means that you're shorter than you should be for your age. And you get stunted not because you miss a couple of meals here and there. You get stunted because you don't get enough protein year after year after year because of the Israeli siege on Gaza. And the Egyptians, I don't think, will want to be complicit in this kind of siege and dehumanization. So you will get a different attitude, but I don't think you will get ending the peace treaty, and I don't think you'll get a resumption of war.
My
Professor.
Students first.
I'm a student.
Pardon?
I'm a student, grad student.
Oh, yeah, let undergraduates first, then graduates. Mike, go ahead.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah, so I largely agree with your interpretation about the use of mosques, but I think it's not my interpretation, but the interpretation I agree with is also that a lot of these groups like Hamas and Hezbollah were so affected because they claim to be offering something completely different from the West, which, as you mentioned, is very rightfully seen as the source of a lot of these social dehumanization themes. So my question is, it seems like what's happening right now with the continued status quo means that there's going to be a continued connection between this dehumanization and the West. We can argue rightly or wrongly, but it seems like that's going to be in the consciousness. So, number one, do you think that the use of political Islam is going to continue to be the language with which this disillusionment with the West is going to be presented? And if not, how do you think this will manifest itself in future Arab politics?
Very good questions. The disillusionment, we're not disillusioned with the West. We are critical of American and British and French and Israeli policies. People in the Arab world, if you go there, they adopt and embrace a lot of Western consumer things, technology, your education system. The American University of Beirut, where I teach, is called an American University. It's largely an Arab university. We embrace the values of the West. We covet them. We want to enjoy them. But we're critical of foreign policies by Western governments. You'll find a lot of people who are demonstrating against the U.S. will want to send their kids to American colleges. So this is a reality of our region. I think the Islamic tone of much of the public criticism that you're mentioning is there because of what I said. There was no other tone available. If you tried to speak in any kind of language that was not accepted by the Tunisian or the Egyptian or the Syrian or the Moroccan government, you just weren't, or the Saudi, you weren't allowed to say it. Therefore, the religious groups became the only outlet, and even they were controlled in many respects. So I believe that the transformation of the Arab world, which I think has started now, I believe this transformation will take some time. And when I say time, I mean time. It took you 500 years in Europe to get from the Magna Carta to the French Revolution. It took you another 200 years in Europe to give women the vote. It took 300 years in this country for a system that was based on slave-owning, land-owning white men as the only people who could have a political voice to transform 300 years later into a system in which people of all colors and all genders were allowed to have citizenship rights. These things take time, even in glorious Western democracies that say they are the motherlode of democracy, of 18th century revolutions. It takes time to do equality and true democracy. It's going to take us a little bit of time. I don't say give us 500 years, but I would say at least give us some time to let's see how these systems evolve in a manner that is not controlled by foreign interests. And I believe that what we'll end up with is the critical components of identity in our societies, which are Arabism, tribalism, and Islamism. Those are the three most powerful collective forces and individual forces: Arabism, tribalism, and Islamism. Those three will figure out some mechanism to come together to create a political structure which also includes private sector interests, labor unions, student groups, civil society. But we need time to allow this process to happen. We've never had an Arab country in which individual citizens collectively can come together and define their country, their value system, their policy, their secular religious balance, the role of women and the role of men, the role of the central government and the role of the provinces. We've never done that. We've never seen a system that was defined by the great concept that you helped to give life to in this country years ago, which is the consent of the governed. And so I think when we have this process playing itself out, we'll see a synthesis of Islamist groups and student groups and free market, corporate, globalist, free enterprise people, and all kinds of different groups will come together. So I'm not particularly worried. I don't think you should give too much emphasis to the Islamist rhetoric. This country, understandably, this country is obsessed with, and I think befuddled by, the Iranian Revolution, the hostages that were in Iran, and the September 11 and other terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda. You've had two, terrible experiences with people speaking the language of Islam. Well, the reality is that there's, 350 million Arabs out there who admire what this country stands for and who want to be friends and partners. And you shouldn't take a small minority of people and project onto them what they might do in the future if the Muslim Brothers become part of the Egyptian government. What might they do in the future to Israel and to the US, and then say on that basis, well, I can't take a chance, we have to. I'm not saying you're saying that, but some people are saying that. I mean, that's a pretty silly way to do politics, and it's certainly not the American way. The American way is to give everybody a chance to speak their mind and participate in the political system, and let them negotiate like they're doing in the American Congress now. Let them negotiate and come up with a middle ground based on the rule of law, the protection of the majority rule, and protection of minority rights. So I think this is what will happen in our region. I'm quite optimistic. If Arab countries can experience a slow process of transition where really they can implement the principle of the consent of the governed.
Thanks for the comments.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk today. My question is about Jordan, actually. So in Tunisia and Egypt, the opposition has been targeted directly against the head figures, the presidents themselves. But in Jordan, we see something different. It's targeted against the prime minister and the government, which changes every couple of years anyway, and that's appointed by the head figures. So what do you think the reason for that, in your opinion?
Well, the king of Jordan, I believe, is in a different situation than, say, the president of Tunisia was or the president of Egypt is. I think the king of Jordan has more legitimate links with the population than some of these other people do. Therefore, is less susceptible to being sort of overthrown or pushed out. You have to remember, Jordan and Saudi Arabia are the only two countries in the world in which the country is named after the ruling family. This is the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. It's the Hashemite family. The Saudi kingdom, the kingdom of the House of Saud. The family named the country. So when the country carries your name, that means something. And what it means in Jordan is they have a bit more, they have legitimacy. It's not absolute legitimacy. There are complaints, there are pressures against the king, there's serious demand for change and reform. And the system in Jordan has been one in which you've had an extremely efficient security system, which doesn't allow for significant dissent. And therefore, and the law is you can't criticize the king. If you criticize the king, you go to the slammer. And that's happened to many opposition figures. So people criticize the prime minister, they criticize the parliament, they criticize the weather, they criticize the tourism minister, they criticize all kinds of things, but they're really criticizing the whole government structure. We know that, they know that, it's a game we play, and this is how the system works. But this is going to change, I believe. I think the king got the message, and particularly when people criticize the queen a lot, and she's a proxy target. So the message is very clear, that the large numbers of people want to change the way that power is exercised. And to change the exercise of power doesn't mean to overthrow the monarchy or change the name of the country or anything like that. The problem in Jordan is you have the additional tensions of a Palestinian-Jordanian sort of binational system where the country is made up of Transjordanian, indigenous Transjordanians, and then about half the country is Palestinians like myself who have Jordanian citizenship, who came from Palestine. And we didn't come voluntarily. We came because of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the consequence of creating the state of Israel meant the refugeehood and disenfranchisement of the Palestinians and exile. So the situation is that you also have these internal stresses between Jordanian and Palestinian sentiment, which are mostly political tensions. They only broke out into fighting once in 1970. There's extra reasons there for people to be careful. But I believe you will see in Jordan probably more serious signs of constitutional change that is managed from the top. I think we shouldn't rule out the possibility that in some Arab countries, smart rulers will read the tea leaves and see the reality around them. And especially when people challenge them directly, they'll realize that they have to make significant structural changes, not just superficial, real changes. And I think Jordan may be one of the places that this might start happening. Morocco, I think you see it, Bahrain. I think the monarchies, ironically, are likely to see this kind of change start to happen faster than some of the so-called republics.
Charlie.
What role has the development of like pan-Arab media, broadcast media like Al Jazeera played in these developments? How much has that helped raise the consciousness of Arabs?
The role of the pan-Arab satellite media, I believe, like Jazeera, I believe has been enormous. In fact, I believe that it's much more significant than the role of, say, Twitter and Facebook and the social media and the digital media that people talk about. The two most critical tools, I believe, for what has been going on are the Jazeera and cell phones, and the capacity of people to send messages to each other. In this country, people don't use messaging that much. In our country, the SMS, the cell phone messaging system in our country, in the Middle East, partly because the cost of cell phones was more expensive at the beginning, but messaging was cheaper. So the messaging was an enormously important mechanism for people to alert one another to something, whether the cops were coming, or we're going to have a demonstration here, or let's meet next week, or something. So cell phones and satellite media, I think, are two critical, important elements. Facebook and Twitter and these websites and stuff play a role, but they tend to come in after the fact. Once courageous people get out and start to do something, these media help accelerate and expand a process. What the satellite stations have done is make it clear that your battle is all the Arabs' battle. It was incredibly important in the Tunisian experience. When the history of the Tunisian revolt is written, this will become very clear. That what Jazeera did because the demonstrations in Tunis were going on for 3-4 weeks before they hit the news here or elsewhere. But Jazeera started to relay the message. It did two things. It made other Arabs feel that they're not alone, and that they too can be more dynamic and stand up and fight for their rights, because the Tunisians were doing it. And it made the Tunisians feel more fortified and empowered, because they felt that what they were doing was being broadcast all over the region. It was a form of digital empowerment that compensated for the lack of actual political empowerment in their societies. You couldn't vote, but you could appear on TV and be seen all over the Arab world. And you knew that there was 350 million people, more or less, who were cheering for you. So I think the satellite media played an absolutely crucial role and continue to do so. I've said and written and talked about the 4 M's, the letter M, the 4 M's that now define the power structure and the continuing sort of engagement or the sort of this battle that's going on now, this political battle to create a new Arab world, there's four M's. The monarchy, which is the political power, the mosque, which is the religious tribal groups, the mall, which is the marketplace, the free market economy, civil society. So the mosque, the monarch, and the mall, and the media. Now you have the fourth M, which is the media. A few years ago, I used to only talk about the mosque, the monarch, and the mall. Now I talk about the media. The media, Al Jazeera, in Tunisia, crossed the line, and I think perfectly legitimate line. It stopped being simply a mechanism that allowed people to express themselves and get an emotional, vicarious release of tension, as had been the case before when Arabs would watch Jazeera and see people criticizing Mubarak or criticizing the Americans or criticizing the Israelis. People felt good and say, out of way, go get them. In Tunisia, it crossed the line and became an instrument of social mobilization and political activism. It wasn't Jazeera telling people what to do. It was just the messenger. But by spreading this message of brave Tunisians, it spread this word around the region, and then other people felt empowered. So this is a critically important role.
Hi. How will these events manifest themselves in Syria with Assad's regime?
Slowly. Slowly, because Syria is, again, different. Every Arab country is different. You know, Libya, Syria, Saudi Arabia are places where you won't see immediate street demonstrations. But in all of these countries, again, if you go back over the last 20, 30 years, you can see there were many internal signs of discontent and challenge and whatever, and most of them were put down. The Syrian regime is different than most of the Arab regimes, and they have some elements of serious, I think, legitimacy and why people support them. But they also have problems internally. There are Syrians who complain about lack of democracy. They have economic stress, environmental stress. Syria has huge environmental problems. About 400,000 Syrians have left the northeast and come into the cities. So there are serious pressures and tensions within the country. The Syrian leadership is quite smart. They're very clever. You may like them, you may not like them, and you know there's some things that I admire and some things I criticize in their policies. But they're very agile. They're very clever, and they know how to play the hand that they've been dealt. I would argue today that Syria, I mean, before the Egyptian and Tunisian situation, Syria was and probably is the most important Arab country in terms of regional geopolitical terms. The Syrian government has contacts with every single major actor in every single major conflict. And they negotiate with the Israelis. They have contacts with Hezbollah and the Lebanese government and Iran, Iraq, Turkey, the Saudis, the Jordanians. They're incredible. They're involved with every single conflict and regional issue, and therefore they can play, they have cards to play. You may not like the way they do them, but the fact is they're a player. You've got to, and they're central. And I believe that if, for instance, the Syrians and the Israelis achieved the breakthrough in the peace process, this could have massive implications for the whole region. So I think the Syrian process of change will be much, much slower than in other places. But I think it'll happen because the same underlying forces of grievances are there, that I gave you some of the data. If you go to the Silatec and you see the Gallup data, I mean, the same, we know there's grievances in Syria. There's human rights groups and others who constantly express them. And we know that the political system is top-heavy, and there's a tension there.
Thanks for your speech. The invasion of Iraq was like predicated on creating a bastion, or so the occupation was predicated on creating a bastion of democracy in the Middle East. So among many people in the West, how will they interpret this new wave of democratic reform? Do you think they'll peg it on the political reform in Iraq? And what are the dangers of thinking this way among the West?
What was the last part?
What are the dangers of thinking this way in the West? So
The dangers of?
the dangers of thinking that, or are there dangers of thinking that this new wave of political reform is based upon like a domino effect from the democratization of Iraq?
No, the answer to that is absolutely unconditionally no. Zero.
Well,
Squat.
exactly.
Nothing.
So do you think people will color it that way or speak of it that way?
Well, you will have neocons in this country who will, and they've started doing this a few days ago, who will try to start saying, well, you know, we started this in Iraq and this was, we planted the seeds of freedom. The answer to that is the first documented use of the word freedom in all of human history was from the city-state of Lagash in the 2nd millennium BC in Mesopotamia. So it wasn't the Americans who brought us freedom. It was the Mesopotamians who gave freedom, the concept of freedom, to the world. So I think we have to be very careful about rewriting history. The American and British-led invasion of Iraq wasn't about freedom. It was about weapons of mass destruction. And it was about psychological problems that George Bush had with his father and Saddam. And there was some psychological issues there and things from the past, but from the previous wars. Only later did they start talking about freedom, but it wasn't credible. It was never credible, and we knew it, and they knew it, and they've stopped talking about it. And I think the reality is that the Iraqi invasion unleashed all kinds of forces and problems and pressure. It got rid of a dictator, but there's a lot of other dictators still around. But look at how the Arabs themselves are getting rid of dictators. It's much more suave, much less violent. Of course, some people die. People die in revolutions. Freedom doesn't come cheap. But a few hundred people may die instead of a few 100,000. And the freedom that comes from earning it yourself from within your country is much more stable than the model that comes riding on a foreign tank into your country. So I think the whole Iraqi thing is just one of these, you know, it's really related to the aftershocks of 9/11, the anger that was in Washington, the convergence of pro-Israeli groups who had been wanting to get rid of Saddam for years, with neocon groups, with some Christian fundamentalist groups. All these strange lobbies came together in the Bush White House in 2003 to do this. They did, I mean, it was just an unusual, bizarre moment in time when strange combinations of extremist political groups came together and unleashed this process. In retrospect, I think history will see it as a great moral calamity and a political failure. So I think we should just leave it for history to judge it. I just would add one thing. I think if people in the West say that Arab leaders should be held accountable for their behavior, I think we should ask that Western leaders also be held accountable for the behavior. I think George Bush, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, Tony Blair, people like that need to be held accountable. They need to be held accountable to the court of public opinion and to the morals and legal standards of humankind. If accountability is only something that Westerners do to Arab tyrants, and Western armies and political leaders can do whatever they want with their militaries around the world at no matter what destructive cost, then we have a problem with hypocritical power being exercised by Western governments. And I think the answer is simply to say, let's have a single standard of law and morality and hold all people accountable to the same standard. And I think this is one of the lessons that you'll start finding. If you do get a transformation into more democratic Arab countries, I think you will find people demanding this, that Arab governments will say, well, we want to be friends with the West, but we don't want any more double standards. I can't hear you.
I was wondering what you
I still can't hear you. But just put it closer.
All right. I was
There you go.
wondering what you thought other countries in the region that are likely to experience democratic reform in this wave are.
Which other countries will be affected?
Yes.
I think at one level, which is the level of democratic governance, every single Arab government, with no exception, will be pressured. At the level of democratic governance in terms of accountability, pluralism, participation. The problem is in some Arab countries, citizens are not demanding that. I mean, in some of the Gulf countries that are very wealthy, and I've been there, I know them, you don't have major calls for more democracy. You have some people privately saying, well, we should have a real parliament, we should have elections, but it's not a big issue like it is in most of the lower income Arab countries. So at that level, I think all the Arab countries will feel pressures to develop more accountable, more democratic, more pluralistic, more transparent systems. At the level of state and police brutality and the abuse of power by police states, by security services, armies, police, etc., as we've seen in many Arab countries, some countries will be more pressured than others. And I think you'll find that the combination of economic stress with political autocracy and security excesses, that combination will determine which countries are first susceptible to these kinds of changes. It's not an accident that Tunisia and Egypt were the first two countries to open up and to be pushed by their own people to change. We don't know how Egypt's going to come out. It's a process. It'll take a long time. Not a long time, but we need 6 months at least to see where this is heading. Tunisia and Egypt were the first two because they brought together that combination of social and economic stress, political autocracy, and excessive force by the security services. But most of the countries have some combination of these conditions. So if you look across the region, Morocco, Libya, Sudan, Mauritania, Syria, Jordan, Yemen, I mean, just go across the Arab League. They all have some combination of these problems. And people will articulate this more and more. So it's just an amazing moment of historic change. And I think it's really, really important for people to understand the nature of how significant this is. And it's a chance for people in the West, in the US and Europe particularly, not to miss the boat. When Hamas won the election, the Americans and the Israelis and the Europeans boycotted Hamas. They said, we don't like Hamas, even though they won a democratic election that the US pushed for. Well, you get another chance in life, and sometimes, and here's another chance. Here's a chance for the Western world and Israel to stand behind a process of democratic transformation, even if there's people in that process that you don't like, if they're Islamic groups, Arab nationalists, tribal groups, whatever, the communists, whatever. We even have a couple of communists in the Arab world still. You may not like them, but you need to deal with them because they're legitimate in the eyes of their own people. I think, Sarah Palin is a certified nut, but if I'm dealing with the American government and she's a political actor, I have to deal with her. I can't tell people that, sorry, Sarah Palin won't talk to you. You have to. You disagree with people's opinions, but you have to deal with them because they're legitimate in the eyes of their own people. And I think this is an opportunity for people in the West and Israel to engage with the whole spectrum of political sentiment in the Arab world. just want to get a chair and sit down so that I can.
You claim that Israel is in the driver's seat for peace and that the settlements are the main obstacle of peace. Israel's offered to withdraw from these settlements 3 times. How is that making Israel the aggressor? And you also claim that Israel is a militarist state, but Israel is the only state in the Middle East with political freedom. So I don't quite understand that reasoning. Could you elaborate?
You know, I'd be happy to elaborate. I didn't say that the settlements were the main problem. I said Israeli policies as a whole. The Arab-Israeli conflict started in 1947-48. It started in the 30s, but in 1947-48, Israel was created, the Palestine refugeehood situation happened. The resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict is not based on only resolving the land of 1967. If it were, it would be easy to solve. The reason it hasn't been solved is the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict requires that the Arabs live with an Israeli state that is, like it is now, majority Jewish, about 75% now Jewish. And we need to come to terms with that reality, and we have. We've basically said we're prepared to live with a Jewish majority Israeli state that it in turn lives with a Palestinian state and resolves the refugee issue of the Palestinians fairly. That's where the Israelis have made almost no acknowledgement or progress. The settlements issue is the easiest to resolve, and the Palestine papers that just came out recently showed that we're prepared to tell the Israelis, look, keep around 50% of this big settlements, Ma'ali Adumim, and these big ones that are right on the border, incorporate them into Israel, but give us land of equal value. That's not a problem. They almost had a deal with Olmert and last year. The problem is more than that. The problem is, and the way you described it, I'm talking from a Palestinian perspective, you're talking from a Zionist Israeli perspective. The way you described it is not completely accurate because the Israelis were willing to get out of much of the settlements in exchange for land, but they also wanted to have other controls that were completely unacceptable, keeping soldiers in the Jordan Valley, control of the airspace, et cetera, et cetera. And the issue of Gaza also remains a huge issue to be resolved, the blockade of Gaza. So I think the reality is that we're getting closer to an agreement that resolves the needs of the Israelis, the rights of the Israelis, and the rights of the Palestinians, but we're not there yet. I think what we need is more courageous and honest Arab and Israeli leaders and more decisive external mediators, Americans, Europeans, UN, whoever it is. But the Israelis are in the driver's seat. The Israelis control the land. The Israelis are building the settlements. The Israelis are the people who have the actual control of all of the land of historic Palestine. What we're saying is we're prepared to live with an Israeli state if it stays within the 67 borders with adjustments that we both agree on and resolving the refugee issue, which is the real tough one. The refugee issue is the real tough nut to crack. But I believe it can be resolved. The Israelis have made almost no serious effort to address the Palestinian refugee issue in a serious way. So there is some progress, but we're still a long ways away. And by the way, most of the world is critical of Israel's position. Most of the world, if you look at UN votes, if you look at what people have said in the last 2-3 years, including the US, they're telling Israel, stop the settlements. They're illegal, they're immoral, they're a hindrance to peace. There's nothing right about them. Jews and Israelis might like them. They might like them as a miraculous affirmation of the right of Jews to go back to the land that God gave to Abraham. That's fine for Israeli mythology, but that's not what international law and the United Nations resolutions say. And the American government was clearly opposing that. But it didn't get anywhere. The Israelis were very strong. They pushed back against Obama. The Arabs didn't give Obama what he wanted, which was gestures of normalization with Israel. And therefore, we don't have an Arab-Israeli peace process. But it's a little bit more complicated, I think, than the way you described it. But let's keep working at it.
Victor.
Thanks for coming up. In one of your most recent articles, you argue that the Egyptian military should not be leading the political change that's currently taking place. Who then do you think should be leading that change? And if there's some degree of American or European involvement, how should those foreign actors go about act to avoid creating the illusion that whatever state comes about afterwards is essentially a tool of the West?
I think you need a coalition of the credible key players in Egypt, and that includes the military. But putting Omar Sleiman in place of Hosni Mubarak is replacing one old general with another old general, and that just doesn't do it. I don't think that's the way to do it. And I think the reality is that what you need to do is start immediately with a kind of collective leadership. Keep Mubarak where he is for the moment. Create a collective leadership, Muslim brothers, student groups, labor unions, big businessmen, one or two of the traditional political parties, some of the human rights groups. These are the big players in Egypt. And they're all representing important constituencies in the country. I think a coalition of these groups is best placed to start a transition because everybody feels they have a say in the process. Nobody feels excluded. And it's not then in the hands of the Egyptian military to decide who can play and who can't play and who's in and who's out. The Arab military control of political life is the problem. It's not the solution. We need to do two major things to make this transition successful in the Arab world. You need to get the armed forces, security, police, and military establishments somehow under civilian oversight. And you need to get budgets, government budgets, including the expenditures of the royal families and the ruling families, under civilian oversight. The Arab governments and societies have remained the only totally non-democratic region in the world because the executive authorities and the security agencies controlled the money and the guns. And when you control the money and the guns, you control everything. And we've got to break that total control with some mechanism of civilian oversight. And this is, I believe, one of the first things that a transitional process should start to focus on, is how do you make expenditures and security policies accountable to a credible representative civilian mechanism.
I just had like two kind of questions. Like first, discussing the rhetoric before of like different Muslim groups, Islamic groups, you were saying how we shouldn't really take it at face value. But I'm just confused because, like, for example, like when they speak in English media to English-speaking audiences, what they say is completely different from Arab-speaking audiences. Like the Muslim Brotherhood sounds moderate in the American media, but from what I read from like English translations of their Arab-speaking newspaper, for example, and websites, they have called for like a jihad against America, and they have made radical comments. And my other question about like the Israel-Palestinian issue, was just regarding like international law, for example, in the Gaza Strip. It is perfectly legal to blockade a sworn enemy of your state.
Perfectly legal to blockade?
To blockade according to international law and UN conventions if the people in charge are the legitimate government. For example, you said Hamas was sworn in as legitimate government of the people. So that means they have the legal authority. They are a sworn enemy of Israel. So doesn't Israel have the legal right to take actions to protect their civilians? And what do you recommend doing if they remove the blockade?
Well, you've raised 5 or 6 issues. I'd love to give you detailed answers to all of them, but I'll just give you quick ones because we don't have time. You're perfectly allowed to defend yourself. You're not allowed to inflict a blockade on civilian populations. That's against international law. Second of all, if Israel feels that it is justified in doing what it is doing, then why doesn't it take it to the best councils of the global community and address it through, for instance, the Goldstone report? Judge Richard Goldstone is the single most credible jurist in the entire world, I believe. He's an amazing man. If anybody knows Richard Goldstone, what he did in South Africa. And the Goldstone report was a very thorough analysis. And it provided a mechanism to look at what Israel did, look what Hamas did. and the Israelis refuse to deal with it, and the Americans refuse to deal with it. So what I'm saying is, let's study this issue. I'm not saying Israel is completely wrong. I think they're wrong. But what I'm saying is, let's take Israel's behavior and Arab behavior and put them in a real fair court. And let's analyze their behavior according to international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, UN resolutions, or blah, blah, whatever you want. Let's do that, and then we can have a much better discussion about these issues. Israel absolutely has a right to protect itself, but it has to protect itself within the available mechanisms that humankind has worked out over the last 150 years since the Red Cross started creating the concept of protecting civilians in times of war. So I think these are issues that are very contentious, and it's not very useful to just sort of, make these kinds of statements, because I've been doing this for 40 years and I'm happy to do it for another lifetime, but it doesn't get us anywhere. I think what we need to do is we need to look at our own behavior. Look at, I've been calling my whole lifetime for the Arab world to stop being ruled by police states, and I'm calling for the same application of international law to Arab leaders. I think Omar Hassan al-Bashir, the leader of Sudan, should go to the International Criminal Court and be tried. But I also believe that Israeli generals should be subjected to the same law. You can't apply laws only on one side of a conflict. If there are mechanisms and standards of adjudicating disputes or holding people accountable, they're only valid if they're universal. So absolutely the Arab leaders should be held accountable, but so should Israeli and even American and British and Iranian and other leaders. We must have this universality of law to achieve the kind of stability and peace that we're looking for. The first part of your question was about what the Muslim Brothers say. Of course they say different things to different people. They're politicians. What do you think politicians do? I can take any Republican National Committee or Democratic National Committee person and say what they say in private, what they say in public. But the point is, hold them accountable. Call their bluff.
Like Hamas, for example, is an offshoot Muslim Brotherhood. Look at their rhetoric and their actions.
Their what?
Their rhetoric, for example, Hamas's rhetoric and their actions, pretty correlated.
Yeah, well, hold them accountable. Call their bluff. Hamas is offering Israel a long-term truce. And Israel made 2 truces with Hamas. There was long periods of no fighting. Why did they stop it by attacking Gaza? So there's a huge opportunity to call the bluff. If you don't trust these Islamist groups, Muslim Brothers or Hamas or Hezbollah, call their bluff and bring them to the table. Bring them to the court of international law and international public opinion. That's what I'm saying.
I'm afraid we have to be out of this room at 6 o'clock. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank our speaker today. It's been a very instructive afternoon.